Welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall, and I'm going to start things off with a comment on previous week's news. The alleged oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico now seems to have been forgotten about by mainstream news media. Our view is that they have not been asking the right questions and have merely been putting out the propaganda handed to them by the world's controlling elite. And there is more to this event than merely an accidental oil spill. The BBC news item, which explained the operational headquarters of BP, seemed to be aimed at 2.5-year-olds. In this room they are looking at the blowout preventer, and in this next room Humpty Dumpty is looking through the square window. What can we say about this disaster that the mainstream has failed to report? Firstly, there has been clear obstruction by those involved in controlling the area to prevent the public and journalists from going anywhere near where the alleged spill site is. Contractors who are supposed to be involved in a clean-up operation have all been warned not to speak to anyone about what they know and about what they are doing. Secondly, highly toxic dispersants such as Corexit are being used in massive, unsafe quantities. Some very strange circumstances have led many people to believe that this so-called disaster was deliberately started for some political or strategic reason. Some are alleging that the rig was above an undersea volcano and drilled to depths and at pressures that only previously achieved on land, making this far too dangerous to have ever even been considered, never mind attempted. Others are saying that the video of the oil spilling from the seabed is not genuine and has been fabricated. Also, there are several other oil leaks around the region that are actually the real cause of the oil spill. Toxic rain has been reported on the coasts nearby, which is affecting plant life. Massive security measures have been put in place to prevent people finding out what is really going on. Locals have also claimed that the cleanup operation is simply an empty gesture, and no cleanup operation is actually taking place along hundreds of miles of infected coastlines. The MI5 agent and international war criminal Tony Blair was rumoured in the British press to be in line for the top BP job. The reason Blair would be drafted in is presumably because they need someone without a conscience, who is highly skilled at bullshitting to both the media and the public. Sometimes the best strategy to help conceal murderers such as Tony Blair is to give them a high-profile job. This is exactly what happened a few years back to the murderer Andrei Lugovoy, who murdered whistleblower Alexander Litvinenko by poisoning him with polonium-210. He is now a highly respected politician and hero in Russia. The media seem to have forgotten about that story as well. Strangely, earlier this year, Peter Mandelson was rumoured to have been in line for a top BP job. What that lanky manipulative waste of space knows about the oil industry is beyond me. The G-something or other summit was held last week, where the world's so-called economic crisis was discussed. Will somebody please tell them that the solution to the world's economic woes is very simple? It is to change the system so that money is only used for its original intention, which was to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. Period. Money should not be created out of thin air by an elite few and then loaned to governments at interest. If you remove central banks and their monopoly on creating all new money, and instead allow our governments to create their own new money, so it doesn't have to be paid back and there is no interest, this would solve the world's economic problems for good. Why haven't they thought of that, Richard, you clever shit, I hear you say? Well, it's because our governments are mere puppets of the elite who own the central banks and would kill any world leader who suggested such a solution. Don't believe me? Well, this is one of the main reasons why President Kennedy ended up like this. In the 1600s, the ruling classes used balls, chains, and whips to keep their slaves in check and do their work for them. Today they have concocted a much better system to keep you, their slave, working 37 hours a week. That system is called the monetary system and is much more effective than balls, chains and whips, because most slaves cannot see nor understand the mechanism that enslaves them. But I can assure you, if you work every day of your life and pay taxes, it is enslaving you. Also discussed at the G something or other summit was the axis of evil, Iran and North Korea. America stated that North Korea must be punished for the sinking of a South Korean ship, even though no evidence has been presented to suggest that it was North Korea, an act which the North Korean military vehemently denies. Also, the CIA claimed to have found evidence that Iran are enriching uranium for weapons purposes. The CIA's source is believed to have emerged from Gypsy Lee's palm reading caravan on Newcastle's town moor. It's time to introduce this week's guests onto the Starship. And this week our guests have acquired a wealth of knowledge about the UFO subject and join me today for a discussion on some of the most compelling worldwide UFO cases. So without further ado, let's activate the teleporter and get them beamed up onto the ship. It's Jed Dunbar and Dale Bolden.
Good evening, Richard.
Good evening, Richard.
Okay. Now we had a little discussion last year, wasn't it, 2009, down at Milton Keynes.
That's correct.
But obviously this is a vastly improved set on the rich planet
Great
Starship.
view too.
Okay, now you've come on board today to talk about convincing UFO cases throughout the decades, and we're going to start with Dale, who's going to introduce an event which happened in 1967. Do you want to take it from there, Dale?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this seems to be a little known story, but I think one that is very significant in that in 1967 in Montana, in America, there was a large missile base that controlled a whole load of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And to give you some idea of the sort of power that we were talking about and the importance of the job that the Minutemen missiles were actually doing. Mm-hmm. Each missile contained around 33 times the explosive power of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, and each missile contained 3 of those warheads. Mm-hmm. And the people that were trained to proceed with the launch procedures, etc., were psychologically screened first. They weren't people that were subject to any flights of fancy. They were basically almost like human machines that were reliable.
Highly credible witnesses.
Highly credible witnesses. And at the time, they were in a bunker 60 feet below the ground on duty, basically protecting the United States from any sort of foreign attack from the Soviet Union. And they received a call from the guardhouse in the capsule area where they were 60 feet underground, that there had been strange lights actually seen hovering over the main gate, mm-hmm. Which they basically didn't attach too much importance to and concentrated on focusing on their mission. Mm-hmm. Then they received a second call from a very alarmed senior guards officer saying that he had seen some sort of craft hovering above the gate, mm-hmm. And beaming a light onto different parts of the base. And at that particular point, 10 separate ICBMs shut down completely. All control over the missiles was lost. Mm-hmm. A short while after, that was at their base, but there was basically the way the American defences are laid out. There's a chain of launch stations all the way across the United States. Mm-hmm. There was a second base where a further 8 missiles were shut down. Now, these missiles are in hardened silos that are particularly protected against things like electromagnetic pulses. So when a nuclear weapon goes off, it creates so much magnetic energy it's designed to fry electrical circuits and shut down computers and basically stop cars from working, or to help disrupt the infrastructure of a nation. So they're in hardened silos. So an ordinary advanced sort of weapon that would emit an electromagnetic pulse would not have worked. And yet at the same time, the whole lot, 18 missiles, were shut down. There was an investigation by Boeing Corporation that were responsible for the actual manufacture of the launch systems. And after a lengthy investigation, they just couldn't find what actually shut these things down. But it caused a lot of fuss because at that particular time, a significant portion of American defense systems were completely neutralized.
Okay, and Robert Salas, who was the Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander, who was in that silo, he spoke at the Disclosure Project conference, I believe, and gave his account of basically
Yes, he did.
just
in
these missiles
DC,
becoming inactive. And he stated that it definitely was not a power outage.
Yes.
That something had sent a signal to those missiles to disable them, basically. Okay, and there is evidence that this was covered up. You said that there was an Air Force investigation.
Well, there was an Air Force investigation, an investigation by Boeing, and the Air Force maintained that they've actually released all of the information under the Freedom of Information Act. But it seems clear that there were other pieces of information that were not released, which still remain classified, because I think that generally, even if you're not particularly worried about UFOs, but you're worried about your own domestic audience in the United States and the Soviet Union, if you can say, well, something shut down our missiles, then it doesn't necessarily send a message out of that we are a credible nation that can protect itself. So I think that there's another good reason of wanting to cover it up. But I also ask myself the question of, well, if this was some sort of extraterrestrial event or it was an alien visitation, was it because of the fact that they were aware that one of those particular missiles or multiple missiles were due to become defective or a failure in the computer system, and therefore there could be a launch that should have catastrophic consequences, so they shut the whole lot down.
Right. So they were perhaps
so it could be,
watching over us.
Yes.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jed? Because there are many, many cases of nuclear missile launch facilities having been interfered with by UFOs.
It just seems to be that they are watching over us. It just seems like they're monitoring what's going on constantly. Like we were talking before, and we think they've been here for 1,000 years, definitely hundreds of years. The UFO sites have been going back at least 2, 3, 4 years.
Maybe we're like children playing with matches.
Yes, yes. I think it was Dean Rose on a radio show who recently said that it was like the school teacher coming in the schoolyard, taking the weapons off the children, basically. And I think there's a guy called Bob Hastings who's actually written a book purely about nuclear missile cases involving UFOs. And we can possibly mention the Rendlesham case here, I think.
Yeah, the Rendlesham Forest case, yes.
Because that was allegedly the biggest storage area of nuclear missiles in Europe at that time, in 1980. So it appears that they have a great interest in nuclear missile sites. So you would think that they're just keeping an eye to stop us from... I mean, is that for their benefit or our benefit?
If you take the view of the fact that we are effectively like a project where they're watching over us to see how we develop, whether we develop to higher levels of consciousness and a better understanding of our place in the universe and science and things like this, then as we develop, there are going to be dangers, just in the same way as your child grows. It comes in contact with dangers.
Yes.
And rather than frighten the child, you try to prevent the danger from occurring in the first place by the least amount of intervention. On the other hand, it could be that they're attracted to these nuclear silos and nuclear bases because of the fact that there would be a continuous stream of radioactive energy being emitted as a result of the highly enriched uranium and plutonium. So it could be that they're almost like a radio source, and the frequency of that radio source attracts them in some way. But that doesn't
I think
explain
it's more
why
on
they're shut down.
keeping their eye on what's going on, really.
Keeping their eye on what's going
Yeah,
on.
I think we're very dangerous with the toys that we've got.
Basically animals.
I mean, it could be that a nuclear weapon, I mean, we've only set off relatively small nuclear weapons so far. Perhaps the bigger ones can puncture holes in the fabric of space-time, and they know this, maybe. They're more destructive to the fabric of nature than we realise, maybe. And maybe they know that. But there are a few other factors in that particular case. One was actually sighted directly over the, where the nuclear missile was, and there was never a technical resolution to the cause of the shutdown.
No, they would never find out what exactly went wrong.
So no engineer could analyse the system and find any fault after these systems. So it was as if they sent a signal, the specifically correct signal, to shut that control panel or whatever it is down.
I would imagine that, if you're the President of the United States and somebody rings you and says, we've lost control of 18 of our Minuteman missiles, each with 3 major warheads on, 33 times more powerful than the ones we dropped on Hiroshima, you'd be a bit concerned, and you'd have a very thorough investigation.
You would.
And if it was possible to arrive at a conclusion, you would do.
Okay. And when the security patrol went out to see the UFO, he lost contact on his radio.
Yes.
And this, as we'll see, seems to be a recurring theme. On UFO sightings. As soon as someone gets near to it, no electronic
Radio
communication seems to work.
Away.
Okay, and I've got a quote here from Robert Salas, who was the man in the missile silo. He said that the Air Force has clearly and deliberately hidden the fact that a large number of Air Force personnel reported UFO sighting at the time of our strategic missiles became unaccountably disabled. Okay, and just to mention that the other American Air Force bases which have had similar incidents are South Dakota in 1966 and 92, Wyoming, Walker Air Force Base, and we mentioned Rendlesham Forest. Okay, so, I mean, what else can we say about this particular case, Jed? I mean, does it concern you, or
it does. I'm quite happy to say that they are looking over us, and that I don't think you should be worried about the aliens coming down, disclosure, because I think they've been here for so many years,
right?
Thousands of years, hundreds of years, that there's not a problem.
I heard that. Actually, you can read this. There was a House of Lords debate in 1979 where one of the Lords said that Russia and America signed a secret pact in 1973 to share UFO information so that neither side thought that the UFO was Russia or American, to basically prevent them pressing the nuclear button. So clearly, and I have heard that Kennedy wanted to share the UFO information with the Russians as well, because he wanted to go into space with them, a joint space program. But
the Russians had a very extensive UFO monitoring program under Brezhnev anyway that was kept, very secret.
Again.
Where there was, various, traces left where UFOs had actually landed, and there was still patterns of radiation there. Sometime later, there was a large UFO that was actually seen over Moscow, by large numbers of the military, and people were actually briefed. They took it seriously as something that they could use rather than something that they could ridicule. So they actually took a more positive view of the UFO subject and wanted as many reports as possible to come in.
I mean, speaking from an engineer's perspective, to have the technology to be able to beam whatever they beamed into that silo, to give it the correct signal to shut it down rather than launch it, for example, they would have had to have understood the binary code, they would have had to understand the software, they would have to understand the relays, the whole gambit they'd need knowledge of, but not only need knowledge of it, they'd need to know how to send the right signal in to override it.
Yeah,
I mean,
which is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it's almost as if they've done it from within,
Right. But probably with the computing power that we've got today in a small laptop computer, taking it back to 1967, the laptop computer today with the right software would probably be able to read all the launch codes and everything that was built into it and shut it down relatively easily.
Yeah.
So if we've got somebody who has that sort of technology, but way ahead,
thousands of years,
then
it's not a
maybe you
problem.
can actually sense all of that information remotely, and maybe this information is being transmitted in the terms of photons that carry the information in the form of light.
I mean, you would assume then that they would have certain personnel who are experts on Earth-based technology. Do you see?
Well, the aliens could be reading the human beings' minds, couldn't they? Which
Right.
is,
Or perhaps they've got a copy of the manual from somewhere.
well, if
Well, when you think about it, I mean, we've been broadcasting now since the early 1930s, haven't we? Since the very first transmissions of television and radio have been, going now for well over 100 years. And of course, those have been emanating out into space to be monitored by anyone. So, therefore, even information that is encrypted, maybe for a society that is more technically advanced, the ability to read that encrypted information that's being transmitted from one satellite station to another one, or one military station to another one, all of the information is there. The problem is that for the average human, he can't actually go and decipher that information, but for somebody with more advanced technology, it's probably very simple to.
Okay. All right, then, chaps. Well, we're going to go for a short break now, and we're going to be discussing further cases after this.